Hello and welcome to our first podcast here at WIPEC after our summer break. Unfortunately, the war in Ukraine didn't take a break. On the contrary, the war escalated again. As in the past, I welcome political scientist Professor Mangott, who helps us understand what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yesterday, the Ukraine announced that it started a counteroffensive on the Kherson front with some fast successes. Is this information valid, or do you think it's just propaganda? And what is the situation along the front at the moment?
Well, it's hard to tell. I think it's fair to say that fighting has intensified in the southern Ukraine over the past 2 days. Even the Russian side admits that the Ukrainian side has launched attacks on the Russian defense lines on the western bank of the Dnieper River, so around the regional city of Kherson. However, the amount of the attack, the success rate of these attacks is hardly to be estimated by someone who does not have access to military intelligence data. Even the Pentagon has been very careful yesterday evening about whether or not a Ukrainian counteroffensive is actually taking place. We know, yes, fighting has intensified, but if the Ukrainian side indeed has the manpower to conduct a large counteroffensive, trying to force the Russian forces to the eastern bank of the Dnieper River, is highly contested.
Talking about manpower, last week, President Putin announced to enlarge the Russian army by over 100,000 men. Is this a sign that the so-called special operation is not going well? As at the same time, Russia announced a big military exercise in eastern Siberia, as if Putin wanted to show the world that he has enough soldiers besides to fighting in the Ukraine. What do you think?
Well, this so-called special military operation is not as successful as the Russians had expected it to be. The success is very moderate. It is true that Russia, after refocusing its attack on the eastern region of Ukraine, on the Donbas region, has occupied more territory, now controls the whole of the province of Luhansk, but is still struggling to occupy the rest of the province of Donetsk, where Ukrainian forces still control about 40% of this province's territory. But this announcement by the Russian leadership to increase the target number of the Russian armed forces by 137,000 soldiers indicates that the Russian leadership is indeed aware that the war in Ukraine will last for quite a while. The war will not be over soon, that it may be a war of attrition for the next months and even years. The other question is whether the Russian side is able to increase its target number of soldiers. That's going to be very difficult. First of all, Russia has witnessed over the past years, and will do so in the coming years, that due to low birth rates starting in 1987, and increasing or decreasing even further in the 1990s in post-Soviet Russia, the number of young men who are capable of being enlisted for the Russian armed forces is quite low. What the Russians will need to do to get closer to the target number of 1.15 million soldiers is to increase the recruiting discipline, so the number of Russian young men who are able to evade recruitment will be lowered. Well, it will be a lot more difficult for Russian young men to evade conscript duty in Russia's armed forces, but this will definitely not be enough. So what is necessary for the Russian side is to increase the number of contract soldiers in the Russian army, the so-called kontraktniki, but this will also be a very difficult thing to do. It will only be successful to a certain extent if the salaries are increased markedly for these contract soldiers. But when we go into the detail, we need to say that in order to achieve the target number of the Russian armed forces, the new target number, it will not only be necessary to add about 140,000 soldiers it will be necessary to add even more, because the real force number for Russia's armed forces at the beginning of this war was 850,000, so a lot lower than the target number at that time. And given the fact that the Russian armed forces had suffered heavy losses in the fighting since February of this year, the number of new soldiers that needs to be recruited is significantly higher, up to 300,000.
As it was reported, most of the dead Russian soldiers in the Ukraine are from Russian minorities and from poor people. So did Putin buy their lives to save Russian lives, like Russian from his view? Can we say that?
Well, we need to be careful if we argue that this is a deliberate policy. To a certain extent, it definitely is. But the very fact is that a lot of the contract soldiers enlisted for the Russian army over the past 10 years is from economically poor regions.
Mm-hmm.
And in these economically poor regions, young men actually do see a career perspective in serving as a contract soldier for the Russian army. So there's a difference between the number of contract soldiers the Russian armed forces are able to enlist in economically poorer regions than in economically stronger regions. And in most of these economically poorer regions, a lot of the ethnic minorities in these regions are even poorer than the average, which of course explains why a considerable number of ethnic minorities are trying to get enlisted as contract soldiers and are now among the top numbers of those soldiers of the Russian armed forces killed in Ukraine over the past 6 months. Deliberate it is to the extent that the Russian leadership definitely is not interested to have a heavy toll of dead Russian soldiers in regions where the distance to the Putin regime is already quite significant, meaning the great cities of the country, particularly Moscow and St. Petersburg. And if we look at the casualties of this Russian war in Ukraine, we see that given the population numbers of the various Russian regions, it's definitely many more poor economic Russians that are dying on the Ukrainian battlefield than Russians from economically more successful regions.
Which we can say also happened in other militaries all over the world, like in the United States. You also have a lot of black people going to the army because they think then they have a good chance to get better in life and stuff like this. And it seems to be the same in Russia. Yeah. Mm. In the last week, the situation around the atomic power plant in Saporischschja has kept the world in suspense. Now, I think I've heard the Russians are allowed experts from the IAEA to check on the reactors. Are there still battles going on around there, or is there ceasefire at the moment?
No, indeed, we have ongoing battles, and the Russians claim that Ukrainians have attacked the power plant yesterday, as well as in the previous weeks. The Ukrainians denied and argued that it is the Russians who shell the plants. We can't say from an observer's perspective which allegation actually is true, who is right. But it has been more than 3 months that negotiations have been going on for sending a team of IAEA inspectors to the nuclear power plant, the largest in Europe. By the way, there were many difficulties, not in principle. Both sides agreed that such a mission should take place, but very great differences in the detail. First of all, Western countries and Ukraine are demanding that Russian soldiers leave the power plant, that the region should be demilitarized before the inspectors arrive. Russia has rejected, of course, not surprisingly, this demand. It argues that if we retrieve our soldiers from the plant and the vicinity of the plant, then Ukrainian soldiers will move forward and try to get hold and will get hold of the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhzhya. Another big problem in the talks and negotiations over the past months was which route the IAEA inspector should take. Should they reach the power plant via Ukrainian-controlled territory, or should they travel to the plant via currently Russian-occupied Ukrainian territory? Russians wanted, of course, the latter. Ukrainians demanded that they actually move to the plant via Ukrainian-controlled territory. And it seems, at least if we believe the announcement of Kremlin spokesman Peskov of yesterday, that Russia has given in on this point, that the IAEA inspectors currently on the move to the plant will actually get to the plant via Ukrainian-controlled territory. And we had several other sticking points in these negotiations. Of course, the inspectors need security guarantees. Will that mean that fighting will stop, at least while the IAEA inspectors are in Saporischschja? Or will some of the inspectors remain permanently at the nuclear power plant? And what will be the security guarantees for these inspectors of the IAEA? So a lot of questions are still open, and it remains to be seen whether the ongoing current IAEA mission will be successful in establishing how reliable the safety and security mechanisms at the plant are, and what the damages to the plant are that have emerged due to the shelling over the past months.
Do you know how many atomic power plants are in the region where the fights are taking place? Because if I remember correctly, we had a similar situation quite at the beginning of the war, but it was rather in the north.
It was in the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which of course is closed, and except for the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, Ukraine has 5 more nuclear power plants. But the one in Zaporizhzhya, of course, being occupied by Russian forces already in early March, is the most contested, and the danger of a nuclear escalation is greatest and highest at that plant.
Okay. In the Austrian newspaper Profil, you recently wrote an article about especially from Eastern European countries endorsed travel and visa ban for all Russian citizens. You stated that this is a huge mistake. Maybe can you elaborate on this a bit? Why you think it's a huge mistake?
Well, first of all, a ban on Schengen visa for Russian citizens would mean that we use the principle or apply the principle of collective guilt, namely that the Russian population in total is responsible for the war that was started by the Russian leadership, which is, of course, morally problematic. We know that there are, even if it's a minority, Russians who oppose the war, but due to the heavy fines and the threat to personal security, if those people demonstrated against the war, we have not seen large mobilizations. We had some at the very start of the war, but given the tough censure laws imposed already at the beginning of the war, it's really very, very threatening for Russians to speak out against the war. And this should also be taken into account by EU countries who are now currently debating whether there should be at least a lowering of the numbers of Schengen visa allotted to Russian citizens. Besides, in this piece, I argue that by restricting the access of Russian citizens to the Schengen area, we indeed support the regime propaganda in Russia, because the regime is arguing this is not just a war between Ukraine and Russia, this is a war of the West against Russia using Ukraine. And they argue, well, you see, a visa ban actually demonstrates that we, the government, are right in arguing that the West is attacking the whole of Russia, is against all Russian stuff. It does exclude Russian people from traveling to Europe. And so if we do adopt such strict measures, we would actually fuel the regime propaganda that the West is warring Russia on all fronts. Besides, Russian dissidents or people opposing the war hardly use humanitarian visa to get into European countries. It's very difficult to get humanitarian visa. So a lot of those Russians who have left Russia over the past 6 months has used tourist visa, Schengen visa, to come to Europe and to apply for asylum when they already are in Europe.
What exactly is Erdogan's role in this whole piece? He's always trying to negotiate between both sides. Does he just do this for propaganda as he has elections in Turkey in 2023?
Well, that's definitely one of the reasons why Erdogan is trying to have foreign policy successes. But the major issue is that Turkey has had good relations with both Russia and Ukraine. So it has, of course, supported Ukrainian side in this war. It has asked for a peaceful solution of the conflict, but despite being a NATO member, Turkey has not imposed any sanctions on Russia. So Turkey does have the trust of both Ukrainian and Russian leaders in this respect. And so they are currently the most relevant country for any sort of mediation effort to bring this conflict to an end. And Turkey, together with the United Nations, has already been quite successful in restoring grain exports from Ukrainian ports to the world market in order to alleviate the hunger crisis that has erupted already in many countries, particularly in the east of Africa. So there are indeed already things that the Turkish side has achieved. We also need to remember that at the end of March, the negotiations between Ukrainian and the Russian delegates in Turkey made some progress on finding the political ground for a ceasefire resolution. Well, the talks after that have faltered, and we are very far away from any prospect for a ceasefire, let alone a peace solution. But indeed, Turkey has been quite remarkably successful in this respect. So Turkey will play an important role as a mediator, though I have to say at the moment, I don't see any chance for a successful mediation because both the Russian and the Ukrainian leadership is still expecting military success on the battlefield. And they want to achieve this military success in order to strengthen their negotiation position. So as long as both sides believe in the military success on the battlefield, there will be no talk about a ceasefire, and it will take time until both sides are exhausted and then are more eager to find at least a ceasefire regulation, if not a peace solution for the conflict.
How long do you think will the war last in this year? Because we will have a weather barrier where you can't fight anymore if the rain is coming.
Well, it will be more difficult during autumn rain and during the winter to launch military operations, but it's not that military actions will completely stop. Okay. They will be more difficult. They will be to a certain extent decreased, but not very significantly. So the war will continue even over the snowy winter in Ukraine. Okay.
So there will be no winter break where both sides just defend themselves. It will continue. Okay. That's bad news. Coming to the economic war between the West and Russia, recently Russia started to burn natural gas instead of delivering it to Europe. Is this just another tool of propaganda to show the West that Putin is willing to do anything, even burning Russian resources instead of delivering them and collecting money for them?
Well, actually, Russian production capacity, gas production capacity is higher than what it currently exports to foreign markets. So there's surplus gas on the Russian side. And the question for the Russians is whether it is better to flare the surplus gas, so to burn it and emit a lot of CO2 emissions, or if they should decrease production. And energy experts argue that decreasing production could do harm to the future potential of gas extraction. So that is why Russia is now flaring the gas, which is quite cynical because this gas, which is now burning every day in Russia, could be properly used on the European market. But well, Russia has decided, the Russian leadership has decided to restrict gas exports to Europe by the month, so to speak. And so this is why they are burning the gas and not exporting it. If you compare Russian gas exports to Europe between 2021 and 2022. On the end of July, we need to say that at the end of this July 2022, Russian deliveries were 72% lower than a year ago.
That's a lot, yeah. Why do you think is Europe still so divided over the Ukraine? As Eastern Europe wants harsh answers to Putin war, while Western Europe still tries to keep communications to Moscow open.
Well, it's particularly the Eastern Europeans in the European Union and the northern countries, plus the non-EU country, Great Britain, which is advocating a very harsh strategy for this war. They argue that given the necessary amount of capable Western weapons, the Ukrainian side will be able to win this war. So what we should do now as European Union is to do whatever we can to increase arms deliveries to Ukraine. Germany, for example, with its current government, is rather skeptical of supplying as many weapons as necessary for a complete battlefield victory for Ukraine. It's typical that German Chancellor Scholz has never said that Ukraine must win this war, but his argument has always been Russia must not win this war, which means that for the German government, and this is also true for the current French government and probably the future Italian government, for these countries, it is true that they argue Ukraine should be militarily strengthened, but the war aims in Ukraine are significantly smaller than the war aims of Eastern Europeans and northern countries. For the latter countries, Ukraine should force all Russian forces out of Ukraine at the end of the war, which also means squeezing them out from Crimea and Eastern Ukraine. For the West, for some Western European countries, particularly Germany and France, the war aim that they support is to force Russian forces to retreat to the status quo ante, so to the lines they controlled before the war started on February the 24th. And this friction among Western countries is indeed existing, it's deepening, and it will be deepening if, and that's a big if the Russian side occupies the rest of the Donbas region and then probably announces a unilateral ceasefire. This would be a win-win situation for the Russian side. So if Ukraine accepts this ceasefire proposal by the Russians, which is extremely unlikely, but if it accepts it, then the Russian forces will turn the current front line into the line of a ceasefire and will be able to improve its military control over the occupied territories. If Ukraine refuses such a proposal, which is very, very likely, then the difficulties and differences among EU countries will increase between those countries who would be inclined to force Ukraine or to convince Ukraine to accept a ceasefire offer, and those countries in Eastern Europe and Northern Europe and Britain, for that matter, who will actually encourage the Ukrainian leadership not to accept such a ceasefire and continue fighting the Russian occupation.
As 80% of the economic power or the economic production is in the parts which Russia occupied, I think it's not really a possibility for Ukraine to just give them up, because this country couldn't survive on its own without parts of this occupied territories.
Well, Russia is not only and primarily occupying territory. Russia already is a very large country, but by occupying these territories where the industrial and the mining base of the country actually is, also means that Russia is capable of strangling the Ukrainian economy. And so even if there would be a consensus or a large majority among the Ukrainian population and the leadership to give up the Donbas to the Russians, which is not existing, then this would mean that Ukraine, the rest of Ukraine, would be economically very much weaker than it was before the war. And that is something the Ukrainian leadership simply cannot accept, because this would actually put the Ukrainian economy in a very poor situation, in a very dire situation, requiring Western financial support for a very long period of time.
Coming back to Russia, not long ago, a car bomb killed the daughter of Aleksander Dugin, who is often proclaimed as Putin's ideological mastermind. As I read, you have some theories about who is behind this attack. And is Dugin really Putin's mastermind, or are there other people more influential on him?
Well, I don't think that the position of most Western media that Dugin has been the ideological mastermind of Putin is wrong. He has never been. They haven't even personally met, as far as we know. It's true that Putin, during the corona pandemic, stated publicly that he is reading some of the work of Dugin. But Putin's worldview, his view of the role of Ukraine in the former post-Soviet region, is far more influenced by conservative writers and philosophers like Lev Gumilyov, Konstantin Leontiev, or Ivan Ilyin. So Dugin does not play a key role in the worldview of Vladimir Putin. So that's definitely wrong. So who killed Daria Dugina, the daughter, the 29-year-old daughter of Aleksander Dugin? Well, the most plausible theory for me is that it was the Ukrainian side, that Ukrainian secret agents killed Daria Dugina in an effort not to kill her only, but in an effort to kill Aleksander Dugin, or both of them. But the daughter actually was too insignificant to make her the only target of a bomb attack. Well, it would be reasonable for the Ukrainian side to kill the Dugins because on the Russian far right, Dugin is one of the most influential minds and actors who demand a much harsher war against Ukraine, who want to have a much tougher war against Ukraine, and they are criticizing Putin for being too moderate, too cautious in waging the war. So indeed, Dugin and the far right in Russia is extremely anti-Ukrainian. So killing him would of course be perfectly reasonable for the Ukrainian side. The fact that the Russian Domestic Security Service, the FSB, has identified Natalia Vovk as the one who committed the assassination attack is not very credible. Because if they indeed have monitored this woman for the past weeks, why had they not been able to prevent the bomb attack on the car of the Dugins? So I think that the FSB was interested in an early success of determining who the killer was, and simply invented a story that this specific Ukrainian woman was responsible for the assassination attempt. Successful in the case of Daria Dugina. However, it also might have been Russia's domestic security services for two reasons that are debated in Moscow. First, the theory is that the Russian leadership will increase authoritarian control over Russia and order further repressive measures as a response to the killing. So they might have used the deliberate killing of Daria Dugina as a reason for, or as a legitimization of further repressive measures in Russia, controlling even more the Russian society and increasing censure and repression. And the other theory is that the FSB wanted to send a signal to the Russian far right, because as I've argued before, the Russian far right has been increasingly vocal in criticizing the Russian leadership in how they waged the war in Ukraine, that they are too soft on Ukraine, and it might have been an FSB attack in order to demonstrate to the Russian far right, well, please stop, you need to stop these attacks on the government. And the attack then was a signal to the Russian far right to change its communication over the war in Ukraine. So three plausible theories. We don't know, we don't have any proof. I, of course, do not have access to any intelligence data that various sides might have, but at least I consider the Ukrainian responsibility for the attack to be the most plausible, but not the only possible and plausible one.
Okay. One last question from my side. Is there any change in the public support for the war in Russia? Or is it
Not as
still
far as we can tell.
80%?
I mean, it's difficult to rely on public opinion polls in a country which is actually authoritarian and repressive. But Russian colleagues, mainly sociologists, argue that there is still a majority backing for the war among the Russian population for various reasons. Some indeed want the Russians to gain more territory in Ukraine and regain control over the whole of Ukraine. Others are simply politically apathetic, have been for many years already, and they actually don't like the war, but they simply accept it as the new normal. And others in the Russian population are, of course, supporting the war publicly just because they know that the authorities expect them to support the war. There is an opposition to the war, which is a minority position, particularly among well-educated, more urban, more well-off citizens, more younger Russian citizens who do oppose the war. But as I argued before, given the harsh restrictions on exposing opposition to war, we have not seen large demonstrations or other acts of defying the Russian leadership talk about why the war is necessary. And many of those who oppose the war actually have left Russia over the past 6 months. It's in the hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens who have left the country, which mainly are Russian citizens who want to flee from repression in Russia, or highly qualified young Russians who also would like to avoid repression, but mainly also see no career perspective for them in a very toughly sanctioned Russia in the next years to come.
Maybe one more question about the sanctions. You also wrote a very interesting piece about the sanctions, about how they work. And if I state correctly, you wrote that they are not working as well as we expected on one front. Maybe you can elaborate on this too. Yeah.
The Russian economy has demonstrated to be more resilient than most Western analysts have expected. Even the International Monetary Fund is now arguing that the Russian GDP will decline this year by about 6%. And initially it was expected to decline by 12 to 15%. The Russian ruble has been stabilized, has even gained in external value, but we need to say that this has been done being done on the basis of currency manipulation by the central bank, by tough capital controls. Inflation is high, but it is going down at a very slow pace already. There is indeed, of course, a matter of fact that some of Western products are no longer available in Russia, as many Western companies have retreated from the Russian market. More than 1,000 Western companies have done so. And of course, Western sanctions to Russia have also reduced the level of economic activity on the Russian side. But as I've said, till now, the consequences of Western sanctions have been not as tough as was hoped for or what was expected for. So the sanctions so far have two major effects. First, it's a signaling effect that the West is indeed condemning Russian action in Ukraine. And more important, the sanctions have a punishment effect. They do punish the Russian economy and will do so even more in a midterm perspective, particularly by preventing high technology exports to the Russian side. So far, many Russian industrial branches could still rely on what they still had in their inventories of Western high-tech components, but those inventories are now being depleted, and so Russian industry, including the arms industry, will actually have a shortage of Western components for production, and that will indeed lead to the fact to a development where several industrial branches have to cut production or even close production. So in a midterm perspective, this punishment effect will be even stronger. In the long-term perspective, another effect that we will see is a constrainment effect, which is also part of a sanctions regime. This will mean that Russia's capability of getting enough financial resources and technological know-how to produce arms to wage a war in neighboring Ukraine will decline. So also in this perspective, but only in the long term, the sanctions will be successful. However, in one key respect, which is crucial for sanction policies, namely changing the behavior of the sanctioned state, meaning that Russia would stop its war in Ukraine, the sanctions have been totally unsuccessful. And this will not change even if more sanctions packages will be adopted by the West, and particularly the European Union. The Russian leadership actually values its geopolitical ambitions in Ukraine much higher than the economic and social well-being of the Russian Federation.
Yeah, unfortunately, that seems to be true. Yeah. Well, if you want to add anything, did we forget something important or?
No, I guess we have touched the most relevant issues of the current situation.
Okay, great. Then I thank you again for this interview. And yeah, we'll be back with more information.
Thank you for having me. Thank you as well. And I'm looking forward to another discussion on relevant issues of the Ukrainian war in the future.
Okay, great. Thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye.